Good evening, and welcome to our conversation tonight about criminal justice reform and the governor's task force on racial equity. We're excited that you're joining us this evening, and we're excited that you are a part of this larger work. I'll tell you a little bit about the Reimagining America project in just a second, but let's first start off with a word of prayer. Holy One, we come before you tonight, thankful for all that you do in our lives, knowing that we live in the midst of a world that is divided by race, by color, by class, by creed, knowing that you wish for a world where we are united, where people are treated equally, where those who've been disparaged can have access to equity, where all of us can live in justice. As we gather for this work tonight, we ask that this would be an instrumental piece in our larger work to bring about a better world. Use us for your purposes, be with each of our speakers, and help us all, those who are watching, to come to a different understanding of the need to do something about the racial disparities that we see in the midst of our world. We call on you by many names, but in all of them, we remain grateful to you and ask that you would use us. Amen.
Amen.
As I was saying, I'm the Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler, and I'm a professor at Union Presbyterian Seminary and the director of the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation. I'm pleased to come to you tonight as a representative of the Reimagining America project, in the absence of my colleague and partner, Mayor Jennifer Roberts. I want to just talk to you a little bit about how we came to be. The Reimagining America project is actually a grassroots effort to say, we are tired of looking at the situation of racial disparities in America. We're tired of looking at the way that people are treated differently because of the color of their skin by every system in our society, the educational system, the healthcare system, the criminal justice system, and indeed every system that we deal with has a different impact on Black and brown folks than it does on those with lighter skin. Because of this, we have decided that we need to stand up, we need to step out, and we need to do something significant. We're tired of waiting for someone to have that conversation about race in America that will finally change the tide. If that change is to come, it's up to us to begin to make it happen. So as we come together, we have been meeting for more than 2 years. We've had more than 10 hearings dealing with everything from criminal justice to healthcare to housing to looking at the way that even the environment impacts Black and brown folks differently. Tonight, we come together for an important conversation as we will look at the way that the governor's task force has exposed some of the issues and concerns about disparities that exist in our criminal justice system and the need for reform within. This has been an interesting process. It's been a significant process, perhaps not a perfect process. So we'll hear a little bit about this tonight as we talk. I'm excited to hear from both Henderson Hill as he talks about his role on this commission, Christy Puckett Williams as she talks about the significance of what this work could have done and what it might yet be able to do. But as we come together tonight, I recognize that we've got limited time. So why don't I first start off by introducing our moderator for this evening's conversation. I'm pleased to have my friend Tim Emery, attorney, the head of the Emery Law Firm, a native of Nebraska. How did you find your way all the way to North Carolina through Virginia? Because he's a graduate of college in James Madison University, was it? In Harrisonburg, one of my favorite places on earth, Virginia, and also a graduate of a place I used to teach, the College of William and Mary, where he got his JD. Thank you for your work. Thank you for all that you do with activism. Thank you for all that you do as you address issues of race. Tim, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sadler. Welcome, everyone. And this is an opportunity for us to have an honest and what we hope to be an exciting and meaningful conversation, not only about the governor's task force on racial equity in the criminal justice system, but on what does achieving equity in the so-called criminal justice system? You may hear me refer to it as the criminal punishment system throughout this, and I encourage our panelists to use whatever nomenclature they wish to use to describe these systems. So let's turn to our panelists. We've got two interesting, amazing folks with us tonight, and a little bit of a backstory within the Criminal Justice Subcommittee of Reimagining America Project. Dr. Sadler was saying in a meeting, could we invite some people to talk about the governor's task force and give some honest opinions about the hits and misses and what needs to be done? And I said, I know just the people. And thankfully, they both said yes, and they are here tonight. Henderson Hill is a senior staff attorney with ACLU in the Capital Punishment Project in Durham. After decades-long service as a public defender service in Washington, D.C., is the director of the North Carolina Death Penalty Resource Center and its nonprofit successor, the Center for Death Penalty Litigation, a partner at the civil rights firm, the landmark civil rights firm, Ferguson Stein Chambers here in Charlotte, and is a director of the Federal Defenders of Western North Carolina. Most recently, Henderson served as a founding director of the Eighth Amendment Project, the national campaign to abolish the death penalty. He's launched and continues to serve as co-director of Redress North Carolina, an initiative to unwind extreme sentences through collaboration with community stakeholders, most principally moderate progressive district attorneys. He's previously served on boards of supportive housing communities in Charlotte and Common Justice in Brooklyn, New York. He currently serves as president of the board of the Sentencing Project based in DC and serves on the task force for racial equity in criminal justice in North Carolina. That task force started in 2020. He's a contributor to the web-based project racistroots.org, and he wrote a foreword to Right Here, Right Now, which was published last year. He's a graduate of Lehman College, CUNY, with a BA in economics, and Harvard Law School. Many people have heard of that institution. He has taught courses on trial advocacy faculty teams at UNC, Duke, and Harvard Law Schools, as well as internationally. He's lectured widely on trial skills, death penalty jurisprudence, and death penalty abolition. 2007, he was inducted as a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers. And I will add my own bio note that he was also on the team that finally helped free Curtis Flowers in Mississippi, for anyone who listened to the In the Dark podcast. We are also joined by Christy Puckett-Williams. She is the Deputy Director for Engagement and Mobilization for ACLU of North Carolina. Her direct experience with poverty, drug addiction, domestic violence, and incarceration have led her to pursue a career in policy and advocacy. She is an issue area expert on the conditions of confinement for women and girls, including pregnant women and girls in carceral facilities. She also serves as the chair of Women in Incarceration Work Group for the State Reentry Council Collaborative and is a commissioner on the North Carolina Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities in the Criminal Justice System, NC-CRED. She holds an MA in Human Services Counseling, Addiction Recovery Counseling. She was recently awarded the highest honor by the North Carolina Attorney General, the Dogwood Award, for her tireless advocacy for incarcerated pregnant women. She serves on several boards, both national and statewide organizations, as well as serves as an advisor on many research projects, lending her lived expertise to research. I admire both of these panelists so much for so many reasons, but I think the thing that I admire most about each of them is they live their values. They act consistently across systems and bring their whole self to everything. And I appreciate them both for that. So welcome, Christy. Welcome, Henderson. Let's dive right in. Christy, let's start with you. Your overall impression of, as it's referred to, TREC, that's the Governor's Task Force on Racial Equality in the Criminal Justice System, that was formed, had 5 working groups in 2020, and they did an update to their mini myriad recommendations in 2020 with a sort of a report card in 2021. What was your overall impression? Was it worthwhile? Did it help or hurt the conversation?
I think it's layered, a layered answer. I come from, as you stated in my bio, I had served on a task force that the governor had convened back in 2017. And I knew through that task force, the State Reentry Council Collaborative, that the state actors, even though they said all the good things on the campaign trail, that their true dedication to those things just wasn't there. Like, we had a simple request out of one of our working groups on that task force, and it was to change the language. We know that human first language, people first language, is language that we should be using when we're referring to people who are incarcerated. Like I just did, people who are incarcerated, not inmates, not offenders, not convicts, not felons, et cetera, et cetera. Things that separate people from their humanity. And we had a recommendation that DPS change the language on their website from inmate and offender to people who are incarcerated. And to this day, that hasn't been done. So, when they said they were going to form TREC, I was like, I'm a big critic of Governor Cooper, Josh Stein, the Attorney General, because I have seen just apathy, the lack of urgency and emergency when we talk about racial and ethnic disparities. Ronnie Long, someone who was wrongfully incarcerated for many, many years, and advocated directly to Josh Stein, and he was like, well, and then the Fourth Circuit comes out and says that this man is innocent when he told me, this man is guilty. There's things you don't know. And so that lack of trust for the system that I had from my own life experience and already serving on a task force, I was very skeptical about TREC. One of my statements about any task force is it's going to be all tasks, no force, because what will happen is you will see all these recommendations, but no one is really working to implement and hold accountable. It's like we do all the work of making the recommendations, and you have to argue and sit in committees and go through all these things, and you get the recommendations and you are exhausted by the time it's time to implement. And so it's almost as if the way it is structured is to exhaust the participants. Those who have a sense of urgency and emergency about them become exhausted through the long, protracted process. But then what I knew about TREC was, just like with the SRCC, which is about reentry of coming from prisons, was heavily DPS, the Department of Public Safety, like lots of DPS involvement. And when I looked at the structure of TREC, I knew that they would only get so far because there was lots of system actor involvement, not a lot of community folk involvement, and lots of law enforcement involvement. And so anytime you're talking about holding law enforcement accountable, because they are the gateway to the criminal punishment system, they do lots of things to block that progress, to stall, derail, and detract from the conversation. And so I was skeptical about it. I think that it did do some things well, which was bring the conversation to the forefront about the racial disparities. I think unfortunately, George Floyd sparked a lot in this country. And, this collective awakening that we saw happen in 2020, I'll never forget, on May 31st, 2020, Governor Cooper said very clearly from the command center, "Let me be clear, Black lives do matter." And so I knew then when he said that, I was like, well, that means he thinks he's going to do something about it. And so I also knew that that would mean that the immediate relief that people were looking for would not be immediate, that we were going to have to take incremental steps to get the many changes that we needed. And so I was aware of that. And I think it was my job to try to communicate that to folks, that not that TREC was not going to be effective or that the recommendations wouldn't be implemented, but that we had to be diligent and had to be steadfast in ensuring that those things, holding elected officials, system actors accountable to them.
Thank you. Thank you, Chrissy. Well, Henderson, you had a view from the inside. With all your spare time, you agreed to serve on this task force. So share with us briefly your kind of overall impressions, where it hit, where it missed. Yeah, take it away.
Thank you, Tim. Let me start with where Christy ended. Yeah, it was pretty remarkable to hear a white Southern governor speak in terms of Black Lives Mattering. It was pretty remarkable the summer of 2020. Charlotte had been riven by all sorts of hostility and anger towards the policing authorities. The recent death of Decarius Franklin at the hands of police, just an unnecessary, brutal killing. And yeah, the fever temperature was so high. I thought the city would pop. I did not know the young man Decarius personally, but friends of mine, family members did. And this was a killing that did not have to happen. And I thought something remarkable was happening that summer. And maybe it was naivety, but yeah, I had not had the experience of serving on a task force in North Carolina like Christy. I'd done a lot nationally. I've done a lot of association work, planning work, strategic work, and the opportunity to to contribute to something that I thought had some real promise to move the needle in North Carolina was just too attractive to turn down. And I must say, before getting to the many criticisms of the task force, let me just say that, leading a work group that included a white Republican from Transylvania County, county commissioner, it was an experience, an entirely positive experience. Just as his eyes open to issues that are not relevant in Transylvania County, disparities that he just did not see. It was entirely encouraging to see that people's hearts and minds and souls can be opened by information and data, and to give and contend with judges that you respect at the district court and superior court level, but as professionals, as community members, and you're just putting the facts out there and you're hearing things in response. The degree of candor at the working group level was addictive, and it made people work and work hard. I mean, this group spent just an enormous amount of time listening to witnesses on significant issues of racial disparity and on the death penalty, on extreme sentencings, on prison conditions, on matters that are of urgent concern, especially to the Black community. So in that way, the process was helpful. But when Christy says that, that maybe that it was some sort of diversionary tactic, it's hard not to see some of that in the process. When I looked through the recommendations that were made by the task force, I can say all of them that came out of my working group were the fruits of hard work, reflective thought. I stand by the effort that was made by my fellow task members. But not all of the committees were as well balanced. I mean, some of the strongest voices from communities came from outside the walls of prisons, who called in during public comment periods. We got more truth out of those contributions on telephone calls to the public meetings than I dare say we got from some of the deliberations over accountability, policing accountability, about changes that could be made at the Department of Public Service. And it was frustrating to see that if you're listening to the community, we figured out a lot of things that are wrong. We figured out that these racial disparities, they're not new. I mean, they come from the period of enslavement, through the Black codes, through Jim Crow. I mean, this is our lived experience. And so you don't really need, in the larger sense, 25 distinguished committed volunteers from the community to wrestle with some of these questions. You need just listen to the community. You need only go to some of the academics who have studied the problems in Charlotte, in North Carolina, and across the country. These truths have principles that are knowable. And it was frustrating to see some of the good energy committed and ended up just not taking us very far. 120, I think it was 128 recommendations. The one I was most excited about was the 125th was an endorsement of a truth and reconciliation process. But what attention is that going to get when it's recommendation 125? So there were good things about the conversation. It extended the conversation in important ways and important sectors. Different media outlets picked up, and we got some coverage. But it was, I think, disappointing in the way that it sort of all the actors returned to their default positions, and it's just hard to see significant, transformative change coming out of that task force or out of that kind of process.
Yeah, thank you. Was the Truth and Reconciliation, was that a recommendation coming out of your subcommittee, Nerson?
It was,
Okay.
and again, the death penalty has been studied, every which way, and so in some sense, it was a recognition that repeal itself of the death penalty requires legislative action, and you can look across the state to Raleigh and say, well, you're not probably going to get legislative action on this anytime soon. But our elected prosecutors have a lot to do with whether this barbaric relic of a punishment continues. And so even if we're not, within arm's reach of getting repeal past the General Assembly, we got all these elected prosecutors who are responsive to their communities, who know that this is a relic of a gone by time, which should be a time that has passed. So how do we influence them? And, is there a process in which we can bring the truth that's already been identified by academics, by community folks, by through the lived experiences of folks who have been exonerated, who have been wrongfully convicted, who have been the victims of prosecutorial and law enforcement misconduct? These things are known. So let's have witnesses. Let's have truth tellers talk about that. Let's have a process in which some of these stories, sort of escape the courthouse. Part of the problem is so much of this truth is known to lawyers and cops and judges, but doesn't get out to the broader community. And so the notion of a truth and reconciliation process, Reverend Nelson Johnson and Joyce Johnson out of Greensboro are pushing a statewide truth and justice and reconciliation process, looking for ways of getting these important stories out in the public, in the community. And I thought that was an important and useful recommendation, and hopefully it will work in synergy with Reverend Johnson and other aligned groups.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you certainly weren't the only one that thought change was in the air. I remember, I think it was one Saturday evening, when I'm coming home from a protest, and I'm watching on television that the Minneapolis Police Department just gave up a precinct and it's burning, and a former building in downtown Fayetteville that used to hold auctions of enslaved people was burning. And I'm getting text messages from my home state of Nebraska, where there's protests in every large and small town, that I really thought the revolution was coming. For about 48 hours, I thought it was coming. And look at us now. Well, Christy,
they had me going for a lot longer than 48 hours.
Yeah,
like 48 minutes for Christy. For me, they had me in there for like 6 months, living the dream, and I didn't wake up till 6 months later.
Oh, dang.
I did want to take an opportunity to spotlight something really positive that has come since that time. And that's HB 608. And Christy had a lot of impact on that. So Christy, would you share with us what HB 608 is, how your experience informed that, and what that legislation accomplished for people?
Yeah, so HB 608 is a bill that protects incarcerated pregnant folks. Um, you know, I was incarcerated due to my substance use disorder. So my mental health and substance use disorders were criminalized. I was also a victim of severe domestic violence. And so all the system's response to that was to lock me up. And so in one of my last periods of incarceration, I was pregnant. And I went in when I was about 2.5 months pregnant and didn't get out. I took a plea deal to get out because my bond was like $167,000. I received no prenatal care the entire time I was there. Never saw a doctor. Never saw anybody. And so my public defender, Jason St. Alvin, shout out to Jason St. Alvin at Mecklenburg County Public Defender's Office, came to me and said, Christy, he just really laid it out for me. I really appreciate, and when I lecture at law schools to this day, I tell this story because I think it's so important for people who are incarcerated to have as much information as possible from their attorney so that they can make the best decision for themselves. You know, and I knew that taking a guilty plea for something that I hadn't done probably wasn't the best thing on paper, but for my family, that was the best thing. So he explained to me that if I decided to take the plea, I would get out pretty much like the next day. But if I didn't take the plea, there was no time when I would have a trial. Like he didn't know when my trial date would be. And that if I would have the baby while I was there, I would be shackled. I wouldn't be able to labor in the way in which I wanted to. And if there weren't people there to pick the baby up immediately upon my discharge, that baby would then go into state custody. So then I thought to myself, so I'm in state custody, the baby who's first born is in state custody. Like I was at a crossroads. And so I just made the decision that I wasn't getting ready to do that. Like I'll take the plea, I'll get out, because at my limited knowledge, I thought that a felony conviction just meant, okay, I can't carry a gun. Well, I don't carry guns anyway, I'll be fine. Not understanding the many ways in which a felony conviction can disconnect you and disenfranchise you from your many rights, and just really places you into a third and fourth and fifth class citizenship. And so I got out, and 5 days later, I had a set of twins. Now, I had no idea I was having twins. I found out on the delivery table because I had no prenatal care. So here I am, homeless, DSS, probation, all these people are on me. And so, you know, I was able to navigate through that. I had resources. I'm a resourceful person. I advocated for myself. But I also knew that if this was happening to me, this had to be happening to other people. And I just began to investigate. When I began working at the ACLU, I worked with a group called Sister Song who had an anti-shackling campaign for pregnant women. And I didn't know that there were people out there working on that. And so I began talking to them. They had tried to run the bill in the past. They didn't get it passed. It never made it out of committee, never made it to the floor. I will say that Trek laid the foundation for HB 608 to even get passed, because the conversations were happening and folks, decision makers were in those rooms hearing about those, to what Henderson said earlier, they were hearing those conditions of incarceration. So it made the soil more fertile than it had ever been. George Floyd, Trek, us continue to have these conversations really laid the foundation for HB 608 to exist. When we went to the legislature in January of 2021, we were told there was not a snowball's chance in hell that this bill would pass. That's what leadership told us. But I continue to organize and strategize and try to figure out, have conversations. We worked with a doctor, Dr. Carrie Ann Crockett, whose client was pregnant, whose baby died as a result, in her professional opinion, as a result of being shackled during that birth, and the guards refusing to unshackle her patient. And so she called all 100 sheriffs, had conversations with them, because the Sheriff's Association and the Conference of DAs are oftentimes the biggest barriers, legislative barriers that we have to progress in North Carolina. And the sheriffs were opposed to this bill. And so by her calling all the sheriffs, by us working to work on those sheriffs, we were able to get the bill passed. And Bill, I'm happy to say, Tim, not only did the bill pass, it passed each committee in both chambers unanimously and every floor vote was a unanimous vote. So we were able to really ensure that pregnant folks, number one, will receive prenatal care. They will receive postpartum care. They will there are rules that regulate how far a mother can be placed from the baby. There are rules that regulate the nutrition. There are rules that regulate ambulation. How often does she get to rest? Yeah, it's just so many things that the conditions of incarceration were addressed in that bill that were born out of my own experience. I would tell people to imagine being in a cell the size of a parking space, and that being all the space that you have to move about, and what that can cause, the complications that that can cause in a pregnancy. I was in a high-risk pregnancy, unbeknownst to me or anyone else. I could have died. My children could have died simply because I received no care, simply because I was a substance using person, you know, and that was the care that I received. And so it was important for me that we legislate dignity for incarcerated pregnant people and humanity. And I often said it was a shame that we had to legislate dignity and humanity for people, but that's what I was willing to do. And we did that.
Thank you. And to be clear, and not that, you know, we need to have dignity for all people who are locked up, but
Sure.
in Christie's case, you were not even convicted of doing the thing. You were only accused of doing the thing, right?
I wasn't in prison, I was in jail. Yeah.
Yeah, you had the presumption of innocence attached
Mhm.
to you. And you're supposed to be treated a little bit better in those circumstances. And if, you know, that was your level of treatment, you know, imagine the treatment if, you know, you were serving an active prison
Oh,
sentence.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I talk to people who are incarcerated every day. My phone, through tablets, phones, email, you know, all the ways that they could communicate. And what happened to me 14 years ago is still happening today, like to people. So even despite the legislation was a win, but there are people still being shackled. So now we have to, you know, you do the hard work of getting the legislation passed, and now you got to hold people accountable, which becomes the really hard work. And so,
Yeah.
you know, I think when we talk about task force legislation, lawsuits, any of the ways that people are able to get relief, it's not just once you get that win, like now the real work begins of accountability. And I think that's why we see a lot of the things fall off, because we're so exhausted by the process just to get the win. You just want to relax.
Yeah. And as a quick aside, I don't know if you're seeing, but I'm seeing that staffing shortages in various detention facilities are exacerbating the dehumanization. I have a 14-year-old in Cabarrus juvenile detention, which is still named Stonewall Jackson, by
right
the
down
way.
street. Yep.
And he is allowed out of his cell for 13 minutes a day. So for 23 hours and 47 minutes, he is locked down. His meals are brought to him. He gets 10 minutes to shower, and he gets 3 minutes to make a phone call.
Solitary confinement. But
Yeah.
they'll call it something else. They'll say that's
Yes.
administrative detention, segregated housing. Oh, that's safekeeping for his safety. You know, all these names that try to throw you off of the fact that this person is being tortured, because we know that solitary confinement is a form of torture. And so we are allowing, and we are comfortable as a society with a 14-year-old, no matter what they've done, we are comfortable with children, adults, and people, old people, all people, trans people being tortured inside of our prison systems in the name of safety.
Thank you. Yeah. And I want to talk about the accountability piece later. And I've got a lot of questions. We're not going to be able to get to them all because we've got some great conversation. But participants can put questions in the chat. In about 16-ish minutes, we're going to get to those, but want to get them loaded in there so that we can start reviewing them now. So feel free to do that. Henderson, I wanted to kind of zoom in on Charlotte a little bit. And what would you, in your opinion, do you view as the greatest challenge to justice and the greatest challenge to racial justice in Charlotte, given our laws and given the application of those laws by police, prosecutors, and the courts locally?
It's a challenging question, Tim. As I said before, the source of the problem is not new. You know, folks have said that the criminal justice system is broken. You know, smarter people say it's working just just as it's been designed to. If you take that truth and you look from, again, the period of enslavement through Reconstruction and Black codes and so forth, it was easier at some points to see racial animus. And in Charlotte and in Mecklenburg County, where the city council is overwhelmingly Black, where the county commission is overwhelmingly, is significantly Black and people of color. When you look at the mayor and the chief of police and the fire chief and the district attorney, all people of color, it's hard to look at a system as racist through and through when it's being administered by so many people of color. And so, first of all, a shout out to you, Tim, for looking at a system that is as far from being transformative as it can be, and taking on the challenge of talking principles, talking truth. And even though it was an uphill fight, political fight, you were able to shine some attention on truth. I think one of the problems we have in Charlotte is that we are sort of traditionally bound by courtesy and politeness, and we're offended by folks whose feelings are hurt, and when there's a public display of that rudeness. And so when Decarius Franklin was killed in the way that he was, a lot of people were hurt by that and thought that shouldn't be done. And even among the police departments, there was expressions of real pain and hurt and regret, and descriptions of how tragic it was. There's no Bull Connor in Charlotte. There's no Bull Connor in Mecklenburg County. And without that easily identified bad guy, it's often hard to galvanize public opinion and the communities of faith throughout Charlotte and other civic organizations for change, for transformative change. And so what you have are bail policies that don't change, restorative justice ideas that die in the library and don't get enacted. There's just not the kind of momentum to change things. And mind you, many of these folks are people that I have politically supported. Many are good people. But all these good people, I'm not good with quotes, but there's a relevant quote from Martin Luther King that it's the silence of the good people that is so destructive. And what I see is sort of this lack of outrage that we can have a criminal punishment system as diabolical as ours is. And we see the kind of racial disparities, and we see the ways our schools are pipelines to that prison. And it's basically a shrug that we get. And I think some of that comes from the surface level niceness that covers a lot of what goes on in Charlotte. And when you go to the Belmont community, when you go to Villa Heights, when you go to communities that have had entrenched poverty and just cycles, generation after generation after generation, who have been locked out of all manner of opportunities, who for generations have been consigned to the criminal punishment system. And there just doesn't seem to be the urgency to do something about that. And I see that as the biggest challenge. I'm happy that in some progressive churches you can have sort of Wednesday evening conversations and special study groups that expend for months at a time, where communities look into these problems. But getting those conversations out of that particular church and, sort of banding that together as a community. We haven't seen that. And we haven't seen the political leadership to make that happen in Charlotte. And that's a source of distress for me.
Yeah, appreciate you saying that. I think it's this idea that we look to individuals rather than systems, right? That you can be a good person and still preside over a racist system. So thinking about that, Christy, I want to transition you to this is my editorializing, but my sense is some of the TREC recommendations suffer from the failure to address or acknowledge the current role of anti-Black racism in the criminal punishment system. What do you suggest? This is $1 million question as an approach to confront those issues and to encourage those stakeholders to be honest and explicit about that language.
Yeah, so I think when we use language like anti-Blackness and white supremacy, due to white fragility, it just puts white folks at arms, and they have to depersonalize it. When we talk about white supremacy, it is a construct. It is not white folks. Black folks participate in white supremacy all the time and anti-Blackness all the time. We have all been steeped in it. And so we are all impacted by it. We all sustain, maintain, and perpetuate it at varying degrees. And so part of our work is understanding, how does white supremacy culture show up in me? How do I perpetuate, sustain, and maintain it? And then how do I actively work against those things so that we are working in transformational ways? So it really takes taking your ego and setting it aside for a little while and really learning like the ways in which we have all been collectively lied to. History has taught, the victor gets to write history. And so white supremacy won, and it gets to write it out through Confederate monuments, through the death penalty, through the racialized terror that Black and brown folks continue to experience today. And so the only way that we can, really, in order for me to be a 13-year person in recovery, almost to 14 years, I had to admit that I had a problem, and I had to take a look at my life. And so we collectively have to admit that there is a problem, that the true measure of our character as a people is how we treat the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned. And that's Brian Stevenson's words, right? And so how we treat people who are in these subjugated states is a measure of how we feel. Now, white people are just a ride along in the prison system, in the criminal legal system. When we talk about like, well, that happened to white folks too. It does, but you're just ad hoc. You're just there, just like women and girls. You're just there. The main point is to lock up Black folks, Black men specifically, and anybody else who disrupts that free prison labor that the state needs in order for it to continue to thrive. Who is going to make all our signs? Who is going to do the retirement paperwork? Who, you know what I mean? Like, they have printing shops, y'all. There are like 30 plants across the state that incarcerated people work in and thrive in and make billions of dollars for the state. And so we have to understand the historical connection of today's carceral system to enslavement and chattel slavery, and that anti-Blackness and white supremacy were the things that colonizers brought to this country. They brought with them white supremacy. They brought with them all of these things. And so we have to acknowledge that in order for us to move forward from it. And that lack of acknowledgement is why we continue to stay like this.
Thank you, Christy. Yeah. And I believe, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the people who labor in prison for these profits of this pseudo public corporation that's created that sells things, I believe that they're capped at a maximum of $2 per day that they can earn.
Yeah, they have a max.
They have to work a full 8 hours in order to get that $2.
Yes. It is. In one division, I worked with a man who worked in laundry. He sewed the silk stockings that they sold to France. And I asked him, I was like, wow, you sewed stockings. And he was like, yeah. He was like, that Correctional Enterprises just in the laundry division profited $1 billion. So when we think about it, costs $1.9 billion of our state budget to run DPS, but they're making $1 billion just off one division, the laundry division. There's no wonder why the task force is not resulting in 29,000 people flowing out of that system. Who else is going to keep the work of the state going if we don't have free labor from incarcerated people?
And just to tag on to this, this has been true for well over 100 years. Our state Department of Transportation grew out of the Department of Corrections, grew out of the chain gangs, the prison gangs. All of the state roads were built by the chain gang, by essentially enslaved labor, prison labor. So it's just so ground into the culture of the state that their reading of the 13th Amendment liberalizes this slavery by another name. And, folks just can't see that connection. One of the benefits of the Racial Justice Act is that we hope to be pushing out, this sort of public education. So more of it seeps out into the general public. Of course, we've got the headwinds of the demagoguing of critical race theory that's coming from the other side. But this truth has to spill out. And I think what Chrissy says about the prison industries today is so powerful. But part of the power is it's been around since the beginning of the system. Things just have not changed.
Absolutely. So we get a lot of questions in the chat about top priority action items or recommendations from TREC to prioritize. But before we get there, I want to talk about, for either of you, but how do we assess proposed recommendations and proposed changes to the criminal punishment system? What I'm getting at here is sometimes that we can have well-intentioned people recommend things that just further entrench the carceral state or further entrench or empower law enforcement to oppress and marginalize Black particularly, but also brown people. So how do either of you personally sort of evaluate, is this reform a good reform? Is it getting us to where we want to go? Or is it a bad reform? Is it a reform that's just propping up these diseased, racist, white supremacist institutions? Whoever wants to start on that.
Well, one sort of inside frustration I had was that the task force was co-chaired by the Attorney General and by Associate Justice Earls, and with the endorsement of the governor, the chief executive of the state. And so you've got the three institutions of government sort of reflected there. We had legislators as members of the task force. And the truth is, the legislative prospects of any transformative change is a non-starter. And so, you look at the other seats of government, the court, which has a huge bureaucracy, much of what they need to change is dependent on the legislature. They need budget. They can't increase data management. They can't support restorative justice programs. There's very little that they can do if the budget is constrained by the legislature. On the other hand, the executive has an awful lot of discretion, has an awful lot of administrative power. So whether you're talking about the prison system itself, the Department of Public Safety, there's a policy decision about whether or not a 17-year-old who's designated a gang member at 17 is now 36 years old in prison, and he still can't get involved in this program, can't have family visits here, is still being confined by that label that was half a lifetime ago assigned to him as a gang member. That's completely within the executive authority. The power of the governor to grant clemency, parole. One of our urgent calls was to give the governor more resources, more staff, so that he could exercise that power. But how you assign your resources is an executive decision. We got 136 people on death row, on a death row that we recognize to be racist in its implementation and its enforcement. But that's the most expensive prosecutorial goal to defend and to prosecute. And so we're assigning these enormous resources to prop up a system that provides no benefit to anyone, but prevents the governor, prevents the Department of Public Safety from using and freeing up those resources to do something else. And I don't want to get too far into this sort of whether we make a whole lot of short-term improvements on a system that just needs to be taken down. But the Secretary of the Department of Public Safety isn't committed to abolition, so he doesn't see that conflict. He sees a pot of resources that he has. He's able to align some goals in terms of what he's going to pursue with those resources. And so it requires will. It requires a will to seek transformative change and to use the resources you have to push those goals further. It might not be exactly what advocates like us, like Christy and Tim or I would say, but you've got the job, you've got the responsibility, you've got resources, you can move us in that direction. And what was so frustrating is, we could all pontificate about some recommendations, some legislative recommendations, what we can do for data management here, there, and the other. If we had pie in the sky resources. Well, let's assume we don't have pie in the sky resources. With what you got, how do you advance the ball substantially? And what we haven't seen is the will to do that. And that's what's disappointing.
I would just add that, Tim, number one, I am a non-reformist abolitionist, so I do not believe in reform. I believe in transformative justice, which is a liberatory approach to violence, which seeks safety and accountability without relying on alienation, punishment, state or systemic violence at the hands of the police or incarceration. But when I do evaluate policy, because everybody's not an abolitionist, I have to view it through a certain lens. So let's just take policing, for example. I serve on the SBI task force, another task force for excessive use of force currently. And so when they are talking about excessive use of force and, should there be a database or should there be a database? Do they need more training? Do they, like all these recommendations that they want us to come up with, what I have to look at is, does this reduce funding to the police? Does this delegitimize the police, or does it challenge the notion that police are essential to our safety? Does it reduce, again, the tools and the tactics that they have at their disposal? And does it reduce the scale of policing? If it doesn't do those things, then we are just legitimizing police. We're increasing their budgets and continuing to rely on an ineffective method of getting to community safety. Notice I didn't say public safety, because public safety is what the police and the system calls it. But we know that the public ain't safe. We have community safety where we keep us safe, where we have a mutual aid, not charitable, not charity, giving somebody something, where we mutually are stand in solidarity with one another and work to meet collective goals. So those things look like housing, it looks like treatment, it's harm reduction, it's providing Narcan, it's having safe use sites, it's having like, you gonna do this thing, let's help you do this thing more safely. It is, housing, affordable housing. And when we say affordable housing, we mean safe housing as well. Like, you should be able to live in under-policed communities, not communities where police are engaging in broken window policing, where that means they just roll up on you. I've lived in the hood my whole life. They just roll up on you and be like, who you with, where you from, where you going? It's a high drug area. Where you going? Just all of those things, like a stop and frisk. That is how I measure. What are the material conditions? Are the material conditions of my people going to change? If not, then that's not something we need to be working on, because again, Black folks have existed in subjugated and commodified states for so long, and we keep being asked to invest in a system that does not work for us. We keep being asked to stand in gerrymandered lines to vote, for people who don't want us to vote, to serve on juries, potentially to kill our people in a system that we know is not good. Like, all of these things happen daily, and we continue to reinforce them as legitimate processes when we work on reform. When we talk about transformation, that's not taking, reform is just taking what already is and rearranging it. Transformation is taking it to something completely different, something that it was never was before. And so, like, we don't want reform, we want transformation. We want something that actually works for our people. We want where people actually are healthy, happy, and whole. And again, that we're not relying on punishment and policing as a way to get to that happy, healthy, and wholeness. Because we've been here since 1619 at least, and we ain't got there yet. And so, like, why are we keep doing the same thing over and again, expecting different results? If police and jails were a deterrent for crime, you would all have your doors open at night. You would leave your car unlocked. You wouldn't have your iPod, you wouldn't be tracking your iPods and your AirPods. You wouldn't do all that because the world is safe, right? Because people go to jail, that'll make them stop stealing. That's simply not the truth. And so we have to work on things that delegitimize and shift the narrative and shift the tone around what policing, and the criminal legal system actually mean to us. And again, if we truly want to measure our character as a community, it is how do we treat the disenfranchised and the disconnected? And right now, we continue to marginalize, push disconnected and disenfranchised people further to the margins until they engage in behaviors. And we can say, now, see, we knew you were a savage. Now we can lock you up, give you life without parole because you were a bad person all along, with no evaluation of how the system maintained and sustained violence. Because let me just say, for y'all who live in South Charlotte, I know some of y'all South Charlotteans live here, are on this call, poverty is violent. And so when you talk about violence in the community, if you're not assessing the poverty that is in that community, then you're not having a full assessment of the violence in that community. And if you want to get rid of violence in the community, then we need to have a resource share where we get rid of poverty in that community. I promise you, you will see the violence dramatically decrease. But as long as we keep increasing police budgets and funding the police and defunding our communities, we will always continue to see a correlation in high crime.
Thank you, Chrissy. Just quickly, Chrissy, could, for the benefit of those participants who may not be familiar with the talk of transformative change, transformative policies, could you give a really quick example of a transformative processes that we could implement that could replace an existing process in our system?
I would say a good one is, well, I think that a lot of people, when they think about police, they think about citizens review boards, right? And in the 50 years of citizens review boards being in existence, none of them have subpoena power and actually have any power. And so that's a reformist thing. If we really want to engage in transformative justice, then we would not have citizens committee review boards. We would have the police do things like withdraw from the militarization programs, the 1099, I can't remember the number of it, the program that allows them to get the free military equipment. There are so many ways to reduce the scope and the scale of policing that when we talk about defund, it's not just about taking their equipment away or their guns away. It's about if there are vacant seats, not filling those vacant seats. That is transformative because you're not taking away the actual money from their budget, you're just taking the employees that they have on the street. And so those are some examples of ways that you can be transformative when you're addressing policing. So yeah. I think that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a great example. And I think in that example, those weapons of war, those militarized arsenal, that could be accomplished through city council, could it not?
Yeah, the city manager, the city council could recommend that the police not participate in this program. The city manager could say, okay, and they could issue a directive. And, we saw that like after June 2nd, when we were all kettled, 300 people were kettled and almost killed him, you know, and the police tried to suffocate us to death with chemical munitions, that they had this moratorium. They quickly, after the Washington Post posted it and it went viral, the city of Charlotte responded very quickly and wanted to put this moratorium on these chemical munitions. The same way they responded to chemical munitions as a result of a lawsuit, they could say we're not going to participate in militarized policing. I was at Pride this weekend. I can't tell you the large police presence that was there with these huge, I'm talking about, they were offering
Yes.
with these
The
huge
big gun. Yeah.
Is you here for us or them? Like, because I don't know.
And
Like,
they didn't have all the roads blocked off. You know, it's
Oh.
blocked off for most of them, but then there's one road that's open, and they
Yes.
don't do that at Speed Street. They have it contiguously blocked off, right?
I was on the block. I was on the block closer to the stage. So yeah, yes, in order for me to get to the rest of Pride, I had to cross that busy street. Yep.
That's
Mhm.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. I was chaperoning 15 and 16-year-olds who were at a birthday party, and we wanted to see the concert. Henderson, briefly, before we turn to audience Q&A, I want to ask you, maybe no one else will benefit from this, but I know I will benefit from this. How can a practicing criminal defense attorney make, John Lewis's good trouble and serve as a force for change from within a racist disease system?
Yeah, I think, we've got to get used to naming the role of race and racism. And the law profession is basically a conservative profession. We are the engineers of a system that, again, not broken, but has been designed to incarcerate and to oppress minority communities, and most especially the Black community. And so naming that's important. When I first started practicing in North Carolina 30 years, it was difficult to get lawyers to raise Batson claims. Notwithstanding the fact that every jury, particularly on any sort of serious criminal case, was all white, or you'd have one Black juror and 11 white jurors. Yeah, everyone knew what was going on, but you couldn't get people to label it as discriminatory behavior. 30 years later, it's a fairly common thing now that lawyers raise the issue. The response of the court is very different. I think for the last 25 years, there's been information pumped out about racial disparities and the application of bail laws and drug prosecutions. We need to insert that in our pleadings. Lawyers can be members of communities too. And so whether it's a faith community, whether it's a neighborhood association, there are people outside the bar who can be interested in the history and the practice of racial discrimination in the court system. Well, how do we invite those people into this clubhouse to see what's going on? We do it through the pleadings that we file. We do it with perhaps building relationships with influencers. Yeah, we're in a better position to do this now with social media than we were in days gone by. You don't have to depend on the beat reporter who was basically sitting in the lap of the police department and the DA's office, getting all of their information from that source. You've got all sorts of media options for that. So I think part of it is lawyers need to see themselves as real, change agents, and they can't do it only by the filings in the courtroom. Sometimes it means packing the courtroom so that the judge sees that the community is watching. Sometimes it means going back to the community and reporting what's going on in the courthouse. I mean, I think part of it is you just can't operate in isolation. This is perhaps the social problem, the civil rights problem of our age. And maybe we missed that moment of reckoning in 2020, but there's a continuing window. I mean, over the last 15 years, new Jim Crow, slavery by another name, there have been all sorts of contributions in the intellectual space. We need to take advantage of that, bring that into our litigation, and bring the community with us when we represent and advocate for our clients.
Thank you. And the general public can certainly engage in that. There are several organizations organizing court support and organizing court watching. And I always remind people, it's such a popular misconception, but our courtrooms are open to the public. And in my experience, when I take a person from the public to court with me for a day, they learn more just from watching with their own two eyes and witnessing things than I can in a, 2-hour lecture
Yeah.
on the subject. So I certainly
And
encourage
Tim, there's
people to
lots
do
of
that.
interest for it. I train
Yeah.
people across the country on court watching. I did a
Yes.
court watching training and somebody put it online, and now I get contacted by people in different states, and I have to acknowledge, like, I don't know exactly how your courtroom work, but sitting there is important. And packing a courtroom can really change the trajectory and how a person is perceived by not just the judge, but by the district attorney as well. Having community support and having connections and ties to the community is a huge way that we can not say a word, but be very powerful.
And not turning down jury service. People who think the opposite of us, the people who, the law and order people, they love to serve on juries. And I often see people who, we can talk about death qualification, but I mean, people who have disparate views and will sometimes answer in such a way that they know that they're going to get knocked off that jury. And you have to be honest and truthful, of course, when answering questions and jury selection, but it's important that people stick that process out and serve, because we deserve a jury that reflects all the views of the community. And oftentimes we don't get our views in the jury.
But then we also have to acknowledge the very real barrier that Black folks face. We don't
yeah.
trust this system. So why would I want to serve on a jury and legitimize a system that I believe is not legitimate, is not fair, is not just? So it puts Black folks continuously on the chopping block. The success or the failure of a system is always on our backs. And so, like, I would suggest that white folks who are our allies should be the ones who are busting down on the jury service doors and standing in solidarity with Black and brown communities, because continue to put the onus on Black folks is just tiring us out even more than what we already are.
Amen. Yeah, well said. Thank you for pointing that out. Dr. Sadler had a question. Who's responsible to enact the various recommendations of TREC? Is there an official recommendation to address these at the local level? Is there any accountability from the state level? So a three-parter.
Well, again, I guess I would go back to some of the remarks I made at the very top. There have been some extraordinary efforts by task force members to work to make this cumbersome process more effective. I think of some of our legislative task force members. I mean, they have been working to get, to find common ground in a General Assembly that's so partisan. It's remarkable that you can get anything done. And I think it's in some ways miraculous that that they have managed to tweak out some reforms. We've had some members of the bench on the task force and sort of working within the bureaucracy that is the AOC, the administrative office. It's a long and cumbersome process to change AO forms, fines and fees, and these things are difficult. We've got an array of thousands of misdemeanor offenses and ordinances that have fines related to it, and it's only poor people that get caught up in that. So that there are legislative efforts to do that. There are some administrative court efforts and court committees that are being stood up to try to modify some of these egregious penalties and fines that really do force more criminal behavior, more law-breaking behavior. I think what Christy said before, that poverty is violence. Well, what do you think the court system is inflicting or poor people when they impose these fines that double and triple over time, probationary fines, restitution costs, all of these things can explode exponentially. Yeah, I think to its benefit, some of the committees continue to work and to try to figure out ways in which they can move the needle. And sometimes, barely perceptible ways when you look at the large picture, but, a transformation isn't going to come overnight. And some of these good folks are working hard to do it. What's frustrating is, on some of the accountability questions, on some of the policing questions, many of the difficult questions are just being thrown back to law enforcement to resolve. And there doesn't seem to be a will to do anything more than recommend that individual sheriffs or police departments look at best practices. Well, those recommendations aren't likely to go very far. And that's pretty disappointing.
Yeah. I look at the internal inconsistencies sometimes in the recommendations, and there's one recommendation or core concept that talks about revising or improving the role of school resource officers, and then later they talk about ending the school to prison pipeline. Well, abolish school resource officers, voluminous data on that. But Christy, what do you say on the accountability piece? How do we hold folks accountable? Who do we need to most hold accountable? What say you?
I mean, to me, the easiest target is Governor Cooper. Like, he can literally sign, he has executive powers of clemency and pardons. If he knows that the majority of people who are on death row, 136 people, over 60% of them are Black and were convicted by all white juries, and he knows that, and he signed a lot of their death warrants when he was Attorney General. I call it the wall of mass incarceration that Roy built, and he has to be that wrecking ball with his signature. What is the point of campaigning, being the most winningest Democrat in the South and doing all these great things, if when afforded the opportunity to provide the relief that people are needing, you refuse to do so? He's been governor now for 5 years, almost 6. He has refused to do the things that he could simply do. And he hides behind his mediocrity, to be quite honest, and gives the illusion of doing something grand by convening a task force, when in actuality, he could have cleared the row. He could have cleared JLWOP. He could have cleared LWOP, a life without parole. He could have commuted sentences. He could have provided a pathway for people who were convicted to life without parole under these barbaric sentencing conditions, to a pathway that would allow them to get their education, to participate, and to return into our communities. But he won't do that because it's not politically safe for him to do so. We do live in a state that is in a deadlock. I am a registered lobbyist. I will be at the General Assembly, Lord knows, in January. So y'all please go out and vote in November and make my job a little easier, not as hard, because I can tell you that I've only lobbied after a supermajority. When Governor Cooper got the veto, I haven't lobbied in a supermajority. I don't want to lobby in a supermajority, because what am I doing? Folks are not, we have so much to lose by not showing up and voting in proper ways. I mean, voting our people in, that it has so many ramifications. And so when I think about the one person, like, yes, we could target certain senators and certain legislators, but that's a whole body. There's like 270 elected officials. But the one person I can focus on as a target is Governor Cooper. And he can do the things that he says, that if he says Black Lives Matter, what we have said to him is, show us that they matter. Because when you show us that they matter, when you sign your name to let those Black people out them gates, when it's Freedom Friday or Freedom Sunday or Freedom Monday or whatever day it is, when that happens, then I will know that, yes, Roy Cooper truly believes that Black lives matter. But until that day, I know that Roy Cooper is just saying what needs to be said to get Black people's votes when it's time to vote.
I believe it was James Baldwin, right? I don't believe what you say because I see what you do.
I see what you do.
Just a quick explanatory comma. JLWOP is the juvenile life without parole. We have people, I was going to say young people, they're no longer young people. They're in some cases elderly people who were sentenced, who were tried as children some have served in excess of 45 years in prison. And that's an area, so when we talk about what could most be implemented, because we've got a couple of questions about that. Pat asked about that. Amy asked about that. I think that, let me scroll down. I hope, I mean, I want to believe it's the Gladys Knight, but it says Gladys Knights. That could just be an alias, but I want to, in my imagination, believe that Gladys Knight herself is watching. But actionable items, certainly things that are within the governor's unilateral purview that don't require legislative action. What else do we want to add to that list of things that are most actionable? Henderson, any thoughts?
Well, I think almost everything within the executive authority is actionable. So, you've got elected district attorney that is making sentencing decisions, that's making plea decisions, that's making bail decisions, that's making prosecutorial decisions. All of those things have led to the tremendous racial disparity in the population in our prison system. We can change that. The years, the decades of mass incarceration and extreme sentencings, well, that grows out of sentencing and plea decisions that are made, all too often based on sort of media coverage, people reading political winds, and not making decisions based on science, on good principles of criminology. Again, while advocates who want to abolish prisons aren't all that anxious about talking about these interim steps, if you're administering the authority to prosecute and to seek to incarcerate, there are best practices that criminologists can identify. The notion that you're going to sentence people to multiple decades for either drug charges or even violent crime. I mean, the notion that violent crime, once you say violent crime, therefore you go into, these extreme sentences, that's got to be broken. I mean, we really do have to reassess what justice means. And what we've got is a system that is built not to think about that big question. It's easier to say justice is equated by, the multiple decade-long sentence you can impose for a crime that inflicts pain or hurt to an individual or community, without thinking whether or not that sentence sort of aggravates the pain of the community, pain of family, creates more in the way of system cycles of violence. There needs to be a mature conversation about justice and how it's achieved. And even if folks are only looking at sort of interim steps before transformation, that question needs to be answered. And, the answer is not a mandatory minimum sentencing. The answer is not preventive detention. We've got to wake up and answer the bigger question, even on the daily decisions that are being made by police departments, prosecutor offices, and judges.
And Tim, I want to add to what Henderson just beautifully stated, right? Like, we really need to ask, what is justice? I'm a victim of what the police would describe as severe violence. I was shot, stabbed, raped by my boyfriend. And I can tell you that I never wanted him to be locked up. I wanted him to stop. And so justice to me would have been a disruption in his behavior, not him being locked up. Because when he got out, he came back out the same person, angrier than he was before. Mad now. Like, if he was mad when he went in, he was real mad when he got out. Right. And so it actually placed me and my family in a lot more danger. I got into this dichotomy of good victim and bad victim, where if I didn't cooperate with the police and the district attorney, all of a sudden, then I was of no use to the system, and whatever happened to me happened to me. And so we also have taught victims victimhood, and we have not assisted them in healing and surviving and thriving post being a victim of a violent crime. We allow them to remain stuck in victimhood. And we do that when we have them come and make those impact statements after somebody's up for parole, after they've been there for 20 years. And then, they're like, oh, well, I'm still very impacted by this. Why? You've been 20 years. What have you been doing the whole 20 years this man was locked up? Like, I'm a victim, and I'm not saying that people should not feel how they feel, right? But at some point, you have to understand that even that violence wasn't even about you. The violence that you experienced was about this other person. And if you can get to that in your mind, that is justice. That is healing. That is moving forward. But leaving somebody stuck in a cage and continuing to be constantly inundated with their badness and your victimhood, that doesn't promote healing at all. And I am saying that as a person who's been on both sides of the system, as a victim of violent crime and someone who engaged in what the state defines as crime.
And doesn't that lack of healing for victims years and years later highlight the total ineffectiveness of the carceral system to address, I think that it certainly harms marginalized people. It's steeped in white supremacy, but it also doesn't serve victims all that well, right?
Right.
Yeah. We had a couple folks wanted to hear about bail, money bail. Anyone want to address that? Can be a thorny, my 2 cents is it can be a thorny issue, and we have to be careful what we replace it with if we abolish. Someone shouldn't have to pay for their freedom, but at the same time, I've seen some states in some jurisdictions abolish cash bail in harmful ways that cause the jail population to actually increase.
Mm-hmm. And there's also the harmful narratives that come afterwards, like out of New York, right? We just saw an article come out of New York yesterday saying that, oh, crime is on the rise. Now, there is no talk about the pandemic's impact on people's mental health, lack of money, Joe Biden ain't getting rid of our student loans the way he said he was going to. Like, all of those things influence people's decision-making, but there's no accounting for that. They only say crime is rising. But when we look at, say, a Chesa Boudin out of San Francisco has one of the highest homeless rates. The housing is skyrocketing. And yes, violent crime has risen, but they put it on his bail and letting people out, and not the fact that people are living in these substandard conditions in one of the world's richest countries, right? That the cognitive dissonance that you must have to see people living high on the hog while you yourself are living in squalor with your family, that type of resentment can influence people's decision making, and they don't have any estimation of that. So let's just say that we're letting violent people out, and let's continue that harmful narrative of tough on crime that actually has not led us to any real community safety, because you can lock all the people up, but you still got people out here doing stuff. So like, it's not like, even if your jail population, say like a Cook County, where they can have like 7,000-8,000 people a day in the Cook County jail. Okay, say it's 10,000 people. Chicago still got gunshots every night. So it really doesn't do what the police have been telling us that it's going to do, or that the system has said it's going to do. So we have to again, I work with a campaign for smart justice. We have lots of money. We have lots of research. We need to be looking at things through what actually does work. Every other system, medical system, science, they're always constantly evaluating what works, what doesn't work. We never do that over on this side in the criminal legal system of what works and doesn't work. We just say, we've been doing this way since the beginning of time.
It's interesting. I've been a lawyer now for 40 years. At the beginning of my practice, the Bail Reform Act was a new thing. And the notion that money bail did not have to be used, that you could have third-party custodians, that you could think about risk of reappearance. And the amazing thing about the early experience with the Bail Reform Act is you absolutely knew clients would show up because they would show up for their court appearance, notwithstanding anything else going on in their lives, because they didn't want to be locked up. So what happened when the tough on crime in the 80s came in, and you just sort of ripped up all the criminology and the social science that went into the Bail Reform Act, and you replaced it with preventive detention, and in its many different forms, and you walked away from the pretrial services as the first opening for dealing with housing issues, transportation issues, alcohol and substance abuse issues, all of the issues that are fundamental to repeated law violation. The non-cash bail alternative of pretrial services were intended to interdict, to intervene, and to start answering those bigger questions, and at the same time keep the community safer. We just rejected that approach and went with cash bail and preventive detention. So again, it's all a matter. It's not like rocket science. It's not like you need to sort of figure this out from anew. Places like the Vera Institute, John Jay College of Criminal, there are all sorts of people that spend lots of time studying systems at work. And you go to the state of Connecticut, they've got innovative ways in which you sort of redirect things away from the carceral state. And if you don't have prison as the ultimate solution, and you're willing to think of these other options, well, then jail and prison, fall down. As you don't have to, it falls into disuse. And that's unfortunately what our system is afraid of. They don't know that other option. They're not willing to in North Carolina, and unfortunately Mecklenburg County, we're not sufficiently interested in these non-carceral options.
Yeah, well said. Two quick things. Our system makes decisions based on emotion and vengeance and less on data. And I think that's a point that both of you made. And that's why I think that the data issues are the most actionable. I mean, we don't even have to go outside of the state, right? We've got the Wilson Center here that would be happy to analyze the data. But we don't gather data, probably because we don't want to see what that data would produce, and that people would move more en masse to dismantle this system. Some really good points and some news that Gladys shared about CMS, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools. They increased teacher salary by letting go of social workers and counselors, right? And I don't remember the exact number, but I once asked a school board member, and I think people should do that. CMS pays for the school resource officers. So CMS, it was well in excess of $10 million that would be saved by eliminating school resource officers from CMS schools that could be used to hire those counselors and those BMTs, et cetera. And Christy has spoken so eloquently. We talked about the spirit of abundance for spirit of scarcity that she talked about in 3 sessions, but it has been wonderful. We do have to wrap, and I am legitimately privileged to call you both friends. So thank you for joining us tonight, and Dr. Sadler will bring us home.
Well, thank you so very much, Tim, for hosting such a wonderful conversation this evening. And I just want to say it was amazing to listen to you, Christy, as you talked about what's going on with this system from so many different perspectives of your work with it over time. Henderson, to listen to you talk about your role on this task force and what it can do and what it can't do. And from both of you, I got the very clear understanding that we don't need to tweak the system. We don't need to reform the system. We need to dismantle the system and put something new in its place that will be truly just, and that will be, to use the word that you used, transformative. Let's engage in transformative justice for a change. Let's engage in a way of reimagining. I think I've heard this word before, reimagining our system. So right now, let me say, before I say anything else, Henderson, Christie, we need you with the criminal justice subcommittee working with the Reimagining America project, because we need to reimagine the system and find a way to make it work. And then once we reimagine it, we need to do everything that we can to put something new in place. So I'm grateful to the three of you for a wonderful conversation tonight. Grateful for Cindy Adcock for helping to put this together along with the Criminal Justice Subcommittee. Grateful to Aaron and Maddie for running the production behind the scenes. And just grateful for the Reimagining America project in general, for letting us see that there is a different way. The system that we have, as Henderson said earlier, is not broken. It's working just the way it was intended to work, but it is breaking. It is breaking people. It is breaking their will to live. It is breaking their opportunity for equality. It is breaking the chance for justice. If we are to have a just, equal society, we need to begin by changing what's going on in our world today. As we close, I want to let you know that we've got some programming coming up. September 19th, we're going to have NC Trusted Elections Virtual Town Hall. And you can begin to register for that now. In this month of October, we're going to have a kickoff event, a national kickoff event that will be focused on environmental justice and the way that we can engage in a more just society. You have to realize that every system in our nation has been negatively influenced by the concept of race, not just criminal justice, not just education, but even the way that we deal with the environment and issues of justice. If we are to have the just, fair society that we need, we have to have victories in each of these systems, and we have to recognize how interrelated they all are. Grateful to you all for joining us this evening. Ask that you participate with us. If you're interested, we usually meet every Wednesday night at 5:30. Every Friday at 1 o'clock, and you are all welcome to join us for this work. This work needs each and every one of us if we are to have the kind of America that we all deserve to have. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Henderson. Thank you, Tim, for the work that you do each and every day to begin to make a better system and a better nation. God bless you all. Let's end with a word of prayer. Lord, we're grateful for what you've shown us through this evening. What you've shown us is that we have a lot of work to do, but we don't lose hope. We don't give up, because we know that not only are you already involved in doing this work, but if we come together, if we work together, if we unite our forces, we can transform this system. The system that we have only exists because we allow it to. But when we as human beings, each and every one, regardless of our color, our creed, our background, stand up and determine that we want to have something different, the system will change. May it be so. We are grateful to you for all that you do in our lives and ask that you would use us for your purposes. Amen. God bless you all. Have a great evening.